Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Railroaded, The Transcontinentals and the Making of Modern America, by Richard White, narrated by Paul Woodson. Introduction. The idea that railroads remade North America and in doing so created the modern corporate world is hardly new. Modern scholars have proclaimed it repeatedly, and in this they only follow the 19th century intellectuals and promoters whom they cite. All of the possibilities that arose with railroads seemed magnified in the Transcontinentals, which came to epitomize progress, nationalism, and civilization itself, not just in the United States, but in Canada and Mexico as well. I have my doubts about civilization, but I will accept the rest. All I would change is that they created modernity as much by their failure as by their success. The very term transcontinental communicated the hubris and power of a new technology that wrapped the continent in iron and steel bands. But the term also communicated the illusory and deceptive qualities of these corporations, which were never quite what they seemed. For the transcontinentals did not really span the continent. In the United States, they had their initial eastern termini in cities and towns along the Missouri River. For connections to Chicago, they depended on what were often far more powerful and better-run roads, the Burlington system, the Chicago and Northwestern, the Rock Island, and others, that sometimes dallied with the idea of becoming transcontinentals themselves, but settled for competing with the lines that reached the Pacific in their richest territories. Only later would the American transcontinentals directly connect to major population centers in the Midwest, and they never stretched to the Atlantic coast. The Canadian Pacific eventually patched together a line to St. John, New Brunswick, but originally it terminated at Montreal with a connecting line to Quebec. It, together with the roughly 130-mile railroad across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in Oaxaca that joined the Pacific to the Gulf of Mexico, were the only true 19th-century transcontinentals north of Panama, although numerous railroads terminating on the Pacific coast took the name. When I write about transcontinentals and other Western railroads, I'm not necessarily talking about railroads in general. I don't have the evidence to do so. But I am still talking about some of the largest corporations in North America. In the late 19th century, large corporations mainly meant railroad corporations and a few other powerful organizations, Standard Oil, Western Union, and Carnegie Steel, that were intimately associated with them. Although Americans still celebrate the West as a bastion of individualism, corporations, along with the federal government, were central to its creation. 19th-century North Americans became quite aware of what transcontinental railroads failed to do, but initially they embraced them, as they embraced all railroads, as the epitome of modernity. They were in love with railroads because railroads defined the age. The claims made for railroads by men who wrote about them were always extravagant. The kind of hyperbole recently lavished on the Internet was once the mark of railroad talk. Here, wrote Charles Francis Adams, the railroad reformer who eventually became president of the Union Pacific, is an enormous and incalculable force practically let loose suddenly upon mankind, exercising all sorts of influences, social, moral, and political, precipitating upon us novel problems which demand immediate solution, banishing the old before the new is half matured to replace it, bringing the nations into close contact before yet the antipathies of race have begun to be eradicated, giving us a history full of changing fortunes and rich in dramatic episodes. Joseph Nimmo, who wrote prolifically about railways, thought, "The railroad, with its vast possibilities for the advancement of the commercial, industrial, and social interests of the world, ran directly counter to the pre-existing order of things." Theodophilus French, a federal auditor of railroad accounts, whose honesty was more suspect than his expertise, thought them the great civilizer of modern times. I am far more interested in the operation of the transcontinentals and other Western railroads in the United States, Canada, and northern Mexico than in the initial construction of these roads, on which there is already a vast literature. What concerns me above all are the entrepreneurs who created them, the men who worked for them, and the large numbers of citizens who came to oppose them as dangerous, corrupt, and threatening. I group the trunk lines of western Canada and northern Mexico with the American transcontinentals because the American roads were so tightly linked to the Canadian Pacific and the railroads of northern Mexico that they cannot be unhooked. Taken together, the American, Canadian, and Mexican railroads were sources of great national pride and great national discontent. But in many ways their most striking quality was that they formed an international network linking the three countries. At one point I had illusions that this would be a comparative book, but I found that I was dealing with one large interconnected railroad system financed from the same sources and controlled by a relatively small set of interests. The Transcontinentals, more obviously than other railroads, were entwined with the state. Governments subsidized them, secured their rights of way, regulated them, and protected them. The first Transcontinentals began as hybrid public-private enterprises and ended up as private corporations, but their public roots remained. By the end of the century, with the Transcontinentals under political attack virtually everywhere, the government suppressed their workers and protected the rights and enforced the obligations of their owners and managers in the name of public good and public order. The railroads, in turn, were agents of the expansion of these states. What these railroads allowed the governments of the United States, Canada, and Mexico to accomplish in the late 19th century was remarkable. In the United States, they took credit for conquering the Indians. As Charles Francis Adams put it, the Pacific Railroads have settled the Indian question. The railroads also took credit for settling the West. They took credit indeed for all of the development between the center of the continent and the Pacific. Non-Indian settlement had taken 2.5 centuries to reach just beyond the Mississippi River in the United States, and had crept only along the eastern Great Lakes in Canada. Neither Spain nor Mexico, despite centuries of struggle, had managed to control the northern reaches of Mexico. Together, these railroads formed a lever that in less than a generation turned western North America on its axis, so that what had largely moved north-south now moved east-west. Railroads poured non-indigenous settlers into a vast region that nation-states had earlier merely claimed. They did not do this in response to a popular demand for development of these lands. Instead, they created the demand through vast promotions unlike anything seen until that time. Having promoted new settlement, they helped integrate these settlers into an expanding world economy so that wheat, silver, gold, timber, coal, corn, and livestock poured out of it. It may seem both churlish and mad to question the railroad's accomplishments. No one, after all, claimed that they came without a cost, particularly to Indian peoples, or that mistakes were not made and a certain amount of corruption generated. But these admissions tend to be of the say-what-you-will variety. Say what you will, the result was worth the price, and the lives of tens of millions of people were the better for it. But questioning these accomplishments is what this book does. The issue is not whether transcontinentals eventually proved to be a good idea. It is whether they were a good idea in the mid and late 19th century. The idea of a transcontinental railroad was not in and of itself bad, but why were so many of these railroads built at a time when there was so little need of them? The 19th century critics of the railroads were often right. These Western railroads very often should not have built when and how they were. Their costs over the long term and the short term exceeded their benefits. In all three countries, the railroad corporations either failed, ending up in receivership, or were rescued by nation-states which forgave loans, renegotiated terms of payment, or nationalized the roads. Their failures as businesses were only the beginning. The railroads were also political failures. Having helped both to corrupt and to transform the political system by creating the modern corporate lobby, which they used to compete against each other, they then found it an expensive and sometimes nearly impossible burden to bear. Their political activities in the western United States and Canada were by the end of the century increasingly counterproductive. Politically, as well as financially, they often became wards of the courts. Finally, they were, in part, social failures. They lured settlers into places where they produced crops, cattle, and minerals beyond what markets could profitably absorb, and where their production yielded great environmental and social harm. It was no wonder that railroad corporations came to be hated, and that opposition to them as monopolies, one of the key words necessary in order to understand late 19th century American and Canadian politics, fueled the reform movements of three countries. These railroad failures are essential to understanding the complicated development of modernity and the historical role of corporations in it. This book owes much to the great economist Joseph Schumpeter, although many listeners will find such a claim astonishing. It is about the utter uprooting of older ways of life and older ways of communication and travel by a new technology in the hands of new men with a new form of corporate organization. It is at first glance, at least, about Schumpeter's creative destruction, the necessity of capitalism always to uproot the old in order to institute the new. It is a book whose central figures are entrepreneurs, and it was Schumpeter who made the entrepreneur the central and heroic figure of American capitalism. Railroads were, in the words of Schumpeter's biographer Thomas McCraw, Schumpeter's favorite example of innovation by new men and new firms. Like Schumpeter, Railroaded emphasizes finance capitalism, the use of credit and the financial markets, as the central engine of corporate growth and expansion in late 19th century North America. It was not capital that built the railroads, but credit, and the capital that was ultimately at risk in the railroads did not belong to the men who controlled them. Thomas Scott, Jay Gould, Collis P. Huntington, Henry Villard, and others were entrepreneurs. The capitalists were the far more anonymous and numerous figures who bought the bonds that allowed the railroads to proceed. The markets these entrepreneurs used and exploited were historical. They comprised particular practices, most with active state involvement, subsidies, regulations, military protection, and so on. In this book there is no such thing as a market set apart from particular state policies, institutions, and social and cultural practices. The question is not whether governments shape markets. It is how they shape markets. The Transcontinentals were, as the economic historian Robert Fogel has written, hothouse capitalism. But the distinctions between hothouse capitalism, garden variety capitalism, and, to extend the metaphor, natural capitalism were ones of degree. A wild capitalism is as much an oxymoron as wild agriculture. Markets are cultivated. They can be cultivated in many different ways with many different possible results. Although the transcontinental railroads emerged in markets shaped by large public subsidies and particular legal privileges, neither subsidies nor privileges were new in and of themselves. American states had subsidized and granted special privileges to canals, banks, and railroads in the 1820s and 1830s. These proliferating and often financially disastrous subsidies had brought about a constitutional reaction in the 1840s that dramatically curtailed the ability of states to subsidize development and lend their credit. It left the ground open for the federal government. Railroad entrepreneurs were innovators. They sought advantage by adopting new techniques. But whereas the celebrations of entrepreneurs usually make their success synonymous with the firm, the men I examine usually succeeded at the expense of the firm. The paradox at the heart of this book is that such individual success as there is usually comes at the price of corporate failure. Personal wealth often brings with it social failure. The innovations entrepreneurs brought to the railroads, financial mechanisms, pricing innovations, and political techniques, were as harmful to the public, to the republic, and even to the corporation as they were profitable to many of the innovators. Many of my entrepreneurs obtained great fortunes, but they created inefficient, costly, dysfunctional corporations. These corporations did spur innovations in production, but that was the problem. They built railroads that would have been better left unbuilt, and flooded markets with wheat, silver, cattle, and coal, for which there was little or no need. They set in motion a train of catastrophes for which society paid the price. They often squandered large amounts of capital and labor for no good end. Many of the investments would have been better made in other sectors of the economy. There is a great truth in the idea of creative destruction, but when applied indiscriminately it begins to look much like a kind of trust in the ultimate benevolence of markets and entrepreneurs that is little different from the older trust in God's plan that Voltaire skewered in Candide. No matter what happens, tout est mieux, all is for the best. The late 19th century West was more Voltaire's country than Schumpeter's. All was not for the best. The basic problem of the transcontinentals is that they were built ahead of demand. That a transcontinental railroad might be a good idea in 1900 does not explain building it in the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s, particularly when the results contributed to two depressions in the 1870s and 1890s, and a sharp, if short, economic downturn in the 1880s. The North American West needed railroads in the late 19th century. What it needed was what turned out to be the functional, if still often mismanaged part of the system, feeder roads into Chicago, St. Louis, and San Francisco. It did not need transcontinentals, at least not the multiple roads that ran from the 100th meridian to the Pacific. These were the roads that never paid for themselves in the late 19th century and left disaster in their wake. They came too early, in too great an abundance, and at too great a cost. The interesting issue is how this happened. To examine these railroad corporations is to see half a continent, the western United States, western Canada, and northern Mexico, in a new light. This is the story of the opening up of a continent that could easily have been opened up more slowly, more gingerly, and more humbly. This is a book about corporate failure and corporate mistakes that were, by almost every measure, economic, social, political, and environmental, transformative mistakes. The railroads were like bad art. They were not accidents. People planned these things. They were purposeful. And insofar as their repeated failures and collapses were part of larger failures and collapses, the railroads also seeded the financial clouds that produced the storms that overwhelmed them. This history of the transcontinentals begins with the genesis of these railroads in the Civil War and ends with the last and largest of their 19th century failures in the Depression of the 1890s. It runs against the grain of what is still a powerful, if long criticized, triumphal narrative of the opening of the West, particularly the western United States. In this traditional view, the West is about promise, progress, and success. It is the homeland of the American future. It is where people go to succeed, not to fail. It is the realm of individualism, not of the state and corporations. This history also cuts against another powerful narrative, again much criticized, about the evolution of corporations and economic development in the United States. The simplest explanation of the emergence of railroad corporations is that they are an expression of a universal economic rationality, and that basic market factors, the costs of producing transportation and the revenues from selling it, determined the form of corporate organization. But if this is the case, then similar technologies and similar economies should produce similar corporations. Great Britain, France, and Prussia, however, did not replicate the American form of railroad organization, although each was a capitalist nation and each employed similar technologies. The best way to understand the transcontinentals' simultaneous failure as businesses and success as sources of individual fortunes for insiders is to regard them not as new businesses devoted to the efficient sale of transportation, but rather as corporate containers for financial manipulation and political networking. They employed rational managers, but they were led by financiers. The financiers made money through subsidies, the sale of securities, insider companies for the construction of the railroads themselves, and land speculation. Each funneled corporate resources into private pockets. to do this, they needed considerable political aid and protection. In the paradox of transcontinental railroads as transformative failures lies their historical importance and interest. The Transcontinentals were monuments to arrogance, ignorance, and greed, but this was not all they were. They shaped modern North America, and saying this involves 5 claims. My first claim goes to their relationship with central governments, the state. In the United States, the Transcontinentals were children of the Civil War and the powerful federal government that Richard Benzel, the American political scientist, has called the Yankee Leviathan. In Mexico, they were the offspring of Porfirio Diaz, the Mexican dictator and centralizer. In Canada, the Canadian Pacific was a product of Confederation. In the United States, the state did briefly weaken after Reconstruction, but it retained far more strength in the West than elsewhere. When we look closely at the U.S., Canadian, and Mexican government relationships with the Western railroads, we find an interlocking network of what I, using the language of 19th century corporate officials and politicians, call friends. The railroads smudged the line between corporate competition and federal regulation. Corporations used the federal government to punish rival corporations while gaining advantages for themselves. They made politics a realm of private competition. My second claim goes to how railroads reshaped the sense of time, and more significantly, space. Railroads, so the cliché goes, annihilated space and time, and they obviously did cut the time and cost of travel. They made the far near. But they did so unevenly and chaotically. 19th century shippers measured distance less by time of travel than by cost, but railroad costs, as we will learn, were an ever-changing realm of mystery. When shippers tried to calculate and compare costs, the map of the West became a crazy quilt whose pieces seemed utterly incommensurate and unstable. Calculating distance by cost meant that places slid across the map in a wild and arbitrary manner. In Washington state, Spokane was geographically closer to Chicago and Seattle geographically more distant when measured by miles, but when measured by cost of shipping goods by rail, Spokane sometimes slid out into the Pacific, while Seattle moved seemingly effortlessly east across the Cascades. The railroads made their customers acutely aware of space, but they also rendered that space radically unstable and seemingly subject to the whims of distant corporations. Virtually all of the bitter political and economic conflicts that followed the construction of railroads in the vast region stretching from the Canadian Pacific south nearly to Mexico City, and from the Pacific to the eastern termini of the American Transcontinentals, were in some sense quarrels over the organization and production of space. People quarreled over where tracks would run, where people would get access to the trains, and whether there would be competing tracks. People argued bitterly and endlessly over the rates charged to move people and goods along those tracks. They argued about who should own those tracks and trains, and who should control the terms of transportation. The third claim of this book goes to the nature of these corporations. They were not the harbingers of order, rationality, and effective large-scale organization. In both Robert Webe's The Search for Order and Alfred Chandler's The Visible Hand, perhaps the two most brilliant and persistently influential books in shaping our ideas of the late 19th century, corporations became the architects of what the political scientist James Scott would later call high modernism. Scott identified high modernism as primarily a state project and made its hallmarks radical simplification and legibility. By legibility he meant the ability of distant bureaucrats and managers to view, measure, and ostensibly control distant places. The census, the cadastral survey, the standardization of weights and measures, freehold property, and much more were aspects of high modernism. Webe and Chandler similarly identified the corporation with managerial capitalism, and managerial capitalism with rationalization, order, simplification, and legibility. The markers of corporate simplification and legibility were as diverse as the timetable, the tables of tariffs for freight, the organization chart, time zones, and new methods of cost accounting. In Weber's formulation, the corporations became a kind of vanguard of American progressivism, bureaucratizing, rationalizing, and seeking the services of experts ahead of the state itself. And in both Weber's and Chandler's view, the corporation emerged as the realm of salaried managers, experts who displaced financiers, entrepreneurs, families, and even stockholders in the control of business enterprises. They were, for better or worse, a force for order. The railroad corporations in this book are not those of Weber and Chandler. On the level of aspiration, what the managers of corporations, as distinct from their owners and financiers, aspired to create, I have little quarrel with Weber and Chandler. The achievement is something else again. Managers blamed their failures on accidents and contingent events, but they also used them to cover their mistakes and claim quite fortuitous results as the fruits of their planning. In his work on the railroads, Chandler relied on the records of boards of directors and the kinds of materials found in annual stockholders' reports. But mine is not a view from the boardroom, or at least not from the boardroom alone. I don't trust annual reports. I try to descend into the bowels of the organization, move to the president's offices, or better yet, to middle management and the workers on and around the trains, and the actual practices of corporations become far more ambiguous and complicated. The corporation was often at war with itself. Both Weber and Chandler were children of Max Weber. Modernity was synonymous with order imposed by impersonal large-scale organizations. The local yielded to the national, the pre-modern to the modern. Individualism gave way to bureaucracy, and temporary disorder gave way to a more lasting order. I do not discern a similar pattern. The organizations I describe here not only failed to institute the order they desired, they also just plain failed, and repeatedly needed rescuing by the state and the courts. Railroad bureaucracy was rife with individualism. We shall see that those who took to their sickbeds or European tours, those who obsessed about manhood, those who were overwhelmed by a sense of failure, were not outsiders, victims caught, so to speak, on the tracks and in the path of an onrushing modernity symbolized by the railroads. They were driving the trains. The local was no less modern than the national. Throughout the book I try to draw a large-scale history down to ground level through stories of individuals whose lives were transformed by the railroads. Through their eyes we see a world that was closer to Dilbert than to Chandler. The dysfunctions of railroad corporations and their expression in individuals were not a mark of the persistence of old practices within new forms, but rather a mark of their modernity. My fourth claim goes to rehabilitating movements, particularly anti-monopolism, that opposed corporations and are now consigned to the scrap heap of history. When late 19th century North Americans tried to identify the centers of power that were transforming their worlds, they identified not the state but corporations, or monopolies as they termed them. For all its failings, anti-monopoly opposition to the corporation was significant. Weber interpreted resistance to both corporations and corruption, the basis of anti-monopolism, as the rearguard and reactionary resistance of local societies at war with modernity. But the merchants, farmers, and workers battling corporations were as modern as the corporations themselves. As state-subsidized railroads emerged as fully private property, they revealed all too clearly in the West the inequality of the new social relations of property. And opposition to this was at the core of anti-monopolism. My final contention is somewhat defensive, and an attempt to preempt what I anticipate will be the most common misinterpretation of this book. This is not a resurrection of the old robber baron literature that Weber and Chandler helped to kill. All of these Western lines do lead back to a relatively small group of promoters and financiers. These men, J. Cook, J. Gould, Thomas Scott, Collis P. Huntington, Leland Stanford, James J. Hill, John Murray Forbes, Henry Villard, and others, are hardly historical strangers, and they have usually been portrayed as bigger than life.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?